Right, so despite the ruling of the International Court of Justice in relation to the 57-year-long Israeli occupation of Palestine, which he has completely dismissed, Benjamin Netanyahu is on a bit of a roll in a genocidal warmongering kind of way, still currently enjoying the backing of the US, the EU and the UK amongst others in continuing to not just strike Gaza, continuing the genocide there, but escalating tensions and widening the war still further, now fully engaged with attacks on those who have stood by the Palestinians, particularly the people of Gaza, with dozens having been killed in strikes in Lebanon, as well as in response to Hezbollah attacks. But now, following the successful drone strike by the Houthis on Tel Aviv, Israel have made direct strikes on Yemen as well, marking a new expansion of Israeli aggression in the Middle East, and they've deliberately targeted civilian areas, not Houthi targets, in doing so. Netanyahu knows the moment the region sees peace, he is finished. He's done for. So he's going out of his way to make this war even bigger. But he fundamentally wouldn't be able to do so if certain countries weren't still handing him the means to carry on. Right, so Israeli atrocities since the International Court of Justice ruled on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestine has not let up one iota. If anything, matters have only escalated. Overnight, another 25 people have been killed in Gaza, bringing the total up to 64 in the last 24 hours. The death toll there now sitting at just short of 39,000. In Jerusalem, Israeli settlers have broken again into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and desecrated the place by performing Talmudic rituals there, and done so under the protection of the Israeli police. Updated figures on the number of journalists killed since the events of October 7th has now risen to 162, and whilst politicians bleat for the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas since October 7th, you might like to know that since October 7th, and over in the West Bank, well away from Gaza, where Hamas hold an estimated 120 hostages, Israel has arrested, since October 7th, a total of 9,750 Palestinians. So why do we never hear about them, effectively kept held hostage as they are? An alleged Hezbollah cell in southern Lebanon has also been struck in the last day. But the latest expansion of Netanyahu's crazed attempts to stay in power by continuing a war he cannot win, for no other reason than it's keeping him in power. He's clinging to power at any cost. He's proving literally at any cost has been to strike Yemen directly for the very first time. Yemen's Houthis have, of course, been attacking shipping bound for or coming from Israel since last November in support of the people of Gaza, saying the only way they will stop is for Israel to get out of Gaza. The ICJ has now ruled Israeli occupation of the Palestinian occupied territories is now illegal, having violated the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter as they have. But this does nothing to Netanyahu. Only power and staying in it matters to him. The Houthis have over time expanded their reach, of course, expanded their targets, been so effective at screwing up Israeli shipping, which Israel is economically reliant upon, sea trade, that the southern port of Eilat at the southern tip of Israel, where it meets the Gulf of Aqaba at the north of the Red Sea, where all Red Sea shipping comes and goes to Israel from, has just sacked off half of its workforce, as Al Jazeera have just reported. The port of Eilat in southern Israel plans to lay off half of its workers this week due to Houthi attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea, its chief executive officer has said. Eilat port is Israel's southern gateway to the Far East, Australia and Africa, Gideon Goldberg told Israeli daily Mariv. All activity stopped because ships could no longer pass in any direction to reach Eilat port or travel towards Europe through the Suez Canal. Therefore, the port halted its operations and income stopped, he added. Goldberg said the port would lay off 50% of its workers this week due to economic losses. Currently, approximately 120 people are employed at the port. The Houthis have repeatedly launched drones and missiles towards Israel and at Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in a show of support for Palestinians amidst Israel's war on Gaza. These people only have Netanyahu to blame for losing their jobs and becoming unemployed. He only had to get out of Gaza for the Houthis to stop their strikes, after all. But following the successful drone strike by the Houthis on Tel Aviv, much further north and on the Mediterranean coast, their reach has now made them a direct target, and a direct target they've become as jets departed from nearby Eilat. Just north of there is the Nevatim air base, for example, so the jets may have originated from there, and they flew south yesterday, targeting the Yemeni port of Hodeidah with an airstrike, which, although presumed to be a gateway for Iranian military supplies to the Houthis, as that port is, and is certainly in Houthi-controlled Yemen, It is also home to a significant civilian population, and as such, the casualty rate is not insignificant, with 6 people having now been reported dead and some 80 injured, as Israel targeted an oil storage facility and a power plant, causing a massive fire which will reportedly take days to put out. International Criminal Court arrest warrant awaitee and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was quoted by German-owned DW News as saying, "The fire that is burning now in Hodeidah is seen across the Middle East and the significance is clear," said Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. He vowed that Israel would carry out similar strikes in any place where it may be required. My takeaway from that is that these Israeli mouthpieces, despite having to deal with the Houthis since last November, still seem completely clueless as just how to deal with them. I'm not sure how many times it has to be demonstrated that the Houthis simply do not have backing down programmed into their psyche, but they really don't. They spent 12 years fighting Saudi Arabia, a much larger, much wealthier country, to a standstill, and that only ended when the Saudis decided to pack up and go home. And they've already made history since October 7th by being the first nation to successfully achieve a naval blockade, as seen in the Red Sea, without the need to have an actual navy of their own. This attack on Yemen itself simply won't achieve anything except to have the Houthis come back probably even more aggressively in response. And this isn't just my opinion, this is the opinion of Israelis too, not least academics from Tel Aviv University. The Israeli Institute for National Security Research of Tel Aviv University says the attack on Yemen's Houthi-controlled areas will lead to the armed group's violent reaction, leading to an almost certain escalation in the region. It contradicted the military claim that the attack on Hodeidah aimed to cut off the arms smuggling route from Iran to the Houthis. Smuggling will continue and even increase. The attack will not deter or stop Houthi attacks, but could actually increase them, it said. The Institute said Israel was sending a message to moderate Arab countries in the West, especially the US, that the policy of containment had failed, and the Houthis must be targeted stronger. Israel will find it difficult to mobilize countries in the region to stand out against the Houthis, although some, especially Egypt, have been affected by their attacks on the Red Sea international trade route more than Israel. It said Arab countries fear the reaction of Iran or their proxies and want to stay out of the line of fire and hedge risks. On the Egypt front, what sprang to my mind there is the fact that Iran backed the Houthis, and both Egypt and Iran are current members of the BRICS economic trade group. So would Egypt come out against one of Iran's proxies, as they get referred to? I'm not so sure. Other than that, it's an interesting notion that this is a signal to the US that the Houthis must be tackled more aggressively. But I certainly agree that this is more likely to escalate Houthi attacks on Israel as a result. Certainly Iran will keep on supplying them with as much gear as they need to do so. I suppose another aspect is how much more it might take for Iran itself to take a more overt role in its response to Israel's expanding warmongering. How long would it be before Iran may have no choice if it continues to expand and reach further and further afield? Would Iran still resist that before it becomes a matter of no choice for them? But if Netanyahu keeps expanding his aggression to keep himself in power, where does that end after all? But coming back to getting the US more involved, the US is getting more and more fed up with Israel. And in light of the ICJ ruling, how much more of an accessory to war crimes does Genocide Joe want to become here? He is apparently already considering sanctions against 2 of Netanyahu's far-right nutjob ministers, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. I'm not going to get too much into that here. I think that one might need a video all of its own. But such actions might provide Biden with an option to reverse his support for Israel, though a much bigger, a much more obvious example of that thinking would be for him to restore funding to UNRWA, the US, now the only country in the world not to have already done so. Equally, if he chooses to go after the Houthis with US military strikes, the Houthis have already shown they're prepared to take on US military ships, so they will do so again. When we need a concerted effort to de-escalate and end Israel's atrocities in Gaza, they are carrying on regardless and attacking any who choose to stand with Palestine either verbally or militarily or even legally, depending on the response. You can't negotiate with madmen with no intention of backing down, and as much as I've always promoted a peaceful negotiated solution, it is how all wars and conflicts eventually end. I just can't see that as being possible here whilst Netanyahu remains in charge in Israel. Is it time the world considered a different approach that can't begin until Netanyahu is made to step down? Meanwhile, I covered the ramifications of the ICJ's historic decision to rule Israel's occupation of Palestine as illegal, with orders to withdraw, remove settlers and settlements, and pay reparations to the Palestinian people with immediate effect, in more detail on this video recommendation here. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.